Squadron leader John Crampton eased the throttles forward at RAF Sculthorpe on the night of April 17th, 1952, lifting a stripped-down RB-45C Tornado into cloud thick enough to hide 4 Merlin-engined fighters. The American jet wore RAF roundels painted over its USAF stars 12 hours earlier. His navigator, Flight Lieutenant Rex Sanders, held a folder marked Top Secret, Swede, containing radar prediction plots of Soviet long-range bomber bases at Orsha, Baranovichi, and Kiev. No British aircraft in service could reach those targets, photograph them, and return. The Americans had loaned 3 RB-45s under an arrangement so tightly held that Prime Minister Clement Attlee had approved the concept before losing the 1951 election, and Winston Churchill had personally signed off the specific sorties from Downing Street 6 weeks earlier. 3 aircraft crossed the East German frontier at 36,000 feet that night, split, and flew independent tracks nearly 1,000 miles inside Warsaw-packed airspace. Soviet radar operators at Rychitsa tracked a fast, high target and scrambled MiG-15S from Bobruisk. The MiGs could reach the altitude. They could not find the aircraft. Crampton's Tornado landed back at Sculthorpe at 0410, cameras loaded with imagery that filled a Bomber Command intelligence gap the Joint Intelligence Committee had described in a February assessment as the single most serious deficiency in Western knowledge of Soviet strategic capability. The photographs went first to the Air Ministry's Directorate of Intelligence in Whitehall, then to the Central Interpretation Unit at RAF Medmenham, and finally within 72 hours to Strategic Air Command at Offutt. The Special Duties flight was disbanded on paper the next morning. It would fly again in 1954. The British problem, however, was already visible. The RB-45 was borrowed hardware, the Americans wanted it back, and Whitehall had committed the RAF to a role, deep penetration strategic reconnaissance of the Soviet interior, that no aircraft on any British production line could perform. The V-bomber force was still on drawing boards. The Canberra, brilliant as it was, could not carry the fuel or the cameras required for the depth of penetration the JIC now demanded. What Britain needed was an aircraft that could fly higher than any Soviet interceptor could climb, faster than any Soviet missile could track, and further than any Soviet radar could reach. English Electric's design office at Wharton, under W.E.W. Teddy, Petter's successor Freddie Page, had begun sketching precisely such a machine in 1948, before the Tornado ever crossed the Elbe. It was called P1 and it was about to become something the air staff had not originally asked for. The specification that would eventually produce the Canberra PR.9, the reconnaissance variant that outflew Soviet air defences for 3 decades, was still being drafted at Adastral House when Crampton climbed out of his cockpit. But the operational demand was already in the room. GCHQ's Y-service intercepts of Soviet fighter control frequencies during the Sculthorpe sortie showed something the JIC found more interesting than the photographs themselves. The Soviets had detected the intrusion, tracked it partially, and been utterly unable to close with it. Air Chief Marshal Sir John Slessor, Chief of the Air Staff, minuted the first Sea Lord 3 days later. The RAF, he wrote, had discovered a gap in Soviet air defense that could be exploited for a period of years, not months, if we possessed the correct aircraft. The correct aircraft did not yet exist. English Electric's chief test pilot, Roland Beaumont, was already flying its ancestor. The Canberra had first flown at Wharton on May 13, 1949, and the Air Ministry ordered it into production for Bomber Command, before the prototype's undercarriage had been retracted a dozen times. Beaumont demonstrated the aircraft to a Central Fighter Establishment evaluation team at West Raynham in 1950 by outturning a Meteor F.8 at 40,000 feet, an altitude the Meteor could barely reach and where the Canberra was still climbing. The reconnaissance variant, the PR.3, entered service with 540 Squadron at Benson in December 1952 and immediately began operations that Whitehall did not acknowledge existed. Wing Commander Freddie Ball's crews flew special duties tracks along the Soviet border from Whiten, from Lucar in Malta, and from Habbaniyah in Iraq, photographing radar installations, airfields, and shipping through oblique cameras that shot across frontiers without crossing them. The PR.7 followed in 1954, with greater range and better cameras, and by 1955, Bomber Command's reconnaissance squadrons, 58 at Whiten, 82 in Kenya, 542 briefly at Whiten before disbandment, were producing a stream of imagery that fed the Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Center at Brampton. The JIC's Soviet Committee, chaired at that period by Sir Patrick Riley, minuted in March 1955 that RAF Canberra imagery was providing approximately 40% of Western knowledge of Soviet air defense deployment in Western Russia. The Americans, running their own U-2 program from 1956, treated the British input as complementary rather than duplicative. Because the Canberras could operate from bases the U-2s could not use and photograph targets the U-2s were not tasked against. But the PR.7 had a ceiling of around 48,000 feet, and by the middle of the decade, the Soviet air defense system was catching up. The SA-1 Guild missile ringed Moscow. The SA-2 guideline entered service in 1957. MiG-19s were reaching altitudes that made the older Canberras vulnerable, and the shoot-down of Gary Powers's U-2 over Sverdlovsk on May 1, 1960, confirmed to Whitehall what the air staff had suspected since 1958. The era of the medium-altitude reconnaissance aircraft over Soviet territory was closing. English Electric had anticipated this. The company, working to specification PR.126 issued in 1955, had already begun stretching the Canberra design into something new. The PR.9 kept the fuselage cross-section, but almost nothing else. The wing was extended, thickened, and given a straight leading edge. The engines were Rolls-Royce Avon RA.24s, later RA.29s, developing over 11,000 pounds of thrust each, nearly double the power of the original Canberra's Avons. The cockpit was pressurized for extreme altitude, and the navigator was moved to a separate compartment in the nose, entered through a hinged canopy. Napier Aero engines designed a special ejector seat for that nose position. The first PR.9 flew on July 27, 1958, piloted by Beaumont at Samlesbury. It climbed to 60,000 feet and kept climbing. The service ceiling was officially recorded as 60,000 feet. RAF crews who flew the aircraft operationally routinely took it to 65,000, and in extremis to 70,000 feet, though the Air Ministry never confirmed those figures publicly, and the air staff requirement documents held at TNA under AIR-20 remain partially closed. The aircraft entered service with 58th Squadron at Whiten on January 23, 1961. Within 18 months, it was flying over the Baltic on tracks that took it deeper towards Soviet airspace than any RAF aircraft had gone since the Sculthorpe operations. The Cuban Missile Crisis was 10 months away. Wing Commander Robert Kemble led 58th Squadron through the crisis of October 22, 1962 from Whiten, where 3 PR-9s stood at readiness, while Harold Macmillan, at Admiralty House, because No. 10 was being refurbished, read the American briefing on Cuban medium-range ballistic missile sites. The RAF's Cuban involvement was tangential. The Canberras were needed for Soviet targets, not Caribbean ones. But the crisis exposed the strategic logic of the aircraft with unusual clarity. When Bomber Command went to Alert Condition 3 on October 27th, Vulcans and Victors dispersed to their war stations, weapons uploaded, engines running at 90 seconds notice, the PR-9s at Whiten were tasked with something the V-bombers could not do: watching the Soviet forward air bases in East Germany and Poland for evidence of a corresponding Warsaw Pact alert. Air Vice Marshal Sir Kenneth Cross, AOC Bomber Command, needed to know whether Soviet long-range aviation was standing up. GCHQ's intercepts processed at Cheltenham and forwarded to the JIC suggested it was not. The PR.9 imagery confirmed it. Photographs taken from over 60,000 feet along the inner German border on October 26th and 27th showed Soviet Tu-16 Badgers and Tu-95 Bears on their normal dispersal patterns at Legnica and Spratawa. No alert. No sortie generation. No dispersal to war stations. That negative intelligence of the absence of preparation for war travelled from Wyton through Jarrick to the JIC and reached the Cabinet Office within hours. Macmillan told Kennedy in the transatlantic telephone conversations of those days that British intelligence saw no sign of Soviet military mobilization in Europe. He was reading in part from what the Canberras had photographed. The PR.9 was becoming what the Air Staff had described in 1958 as a strategic instrument, not merely a tactical one. Its imagery reached the desks of the Prime Minister and the Cabinet Secretary. Its tasking was set by the JIC, not by Command Intelligence, and its existence was, by Whitehall standards, remarkably well concealed. The aircraft appeared at air shows. It carried squadron markings. Nothing in the public record identified it as the specific instrument by which Britain photographed Soviet territory. That distinction between what the aircraft was and what it did was maintained by successive chiefs of the Air Staff for 30 years. The Soviet air defense problem, meanwhile, was becoming acute. The MiG-21 Fishbed had entered service in 1959. The SA-2 had improved. The SA-3 Goa was deployed from 1961. By the middle of the decade, the Warsaw Pact possessed an integrated air defense system that had, in theory, closed the sky over its own territory to Western reconnaissance. In theory, what the PR.9 crews found, operating from Wyton and later from Lucca, was that the theory did not match the practice. The SA-2 required target tracking below approximately 60,000 feet for reliable engagement. Above that, the missile's terminal maneuvering degraded. The MiG-21 could reach 62,000 feet in a zoom climb, but could not sustain altitude long enough to engage a target that maintained speed. The PR.9 cruised at Mach 0.72 at 65,000 feet, a combination that put it just outside the reliable engagement envelope of every operational Soviet air defense system for most of the 1960s. Whitehall knew this from GCHQ's analysis of Soviet fighter control transmissions, and 58 Squadron flew accordingly. The aircraft was not invulnerable. It was, however, uninterceptable by the systems the Warsaw Pact had actually deployed. The distinction mattered. It shaped how the aircraft was used and by whom. The PR-9's operational geography was wider than Bomber Command's imagery alone suggested. A detachment operated from Lucca in Malta throughout the 1960s, photographing Soviet naval movements in the Mediterranean and the Egyptian and Syrian air defense systems that Soviet advisors were building up around Alexandria and Damascus. Squadron leader Ivor Broom's crews from 13 Squadron later merged with 39 Squadron's PR-9S at Lucca, produced imagery that informed British assessments during the Six-Day War of June 1967. The Foreign Office's Eastern Department and the JIC's Middle East Current Intelligence Group drew on that imagery when advising Harold Wilson's cabinet during the crisis. A separate detachment operated from RAF Akrotiri in Cyprus and photographed Soviet warships transiting the Bosphorus and Soviet-supplied air defense installations across the Levant. Further east, PR-9S from 39 Squadron detached to RAF Tengah in Singapore during the Indonesian confrontation of 1963-66, providing tactical reconnaissance for Commonwealth forces under Major General Walter Walker, but also less publicly strategic photography of Chinese airfields in Yunnan and Guangxi. The confrontation ended in August 1966 with the Bangkok Accord. The Canberras remained. When Dennis Healey, as Secretary of State for Defence, announced the withdrawal from east of Suez in the 1968 Defence White Paper. The PR.9 detachments retracted westward. The core mission remained European, and it intensified through the 1970s as the Soviet Union deployed a new generation of air defense systems. The SA-5 Gammon was deployed from 1963, and by the early 1970s had been extensively modernized. The MiG-25 Foxbat entered service in 1970 and could, in principle, reach the PR.9's altitude. The MiG-25 shoot-down of an Israeli reconnaissance aircraft in November 1971 was studied intensely at the Air Ministry and at Jarek. The conclusion transmitted to 58th Squadron via the air staff was that the MiG-25 was a serious threat only in specific geometries. Head-on engagements at short warning, with ground-controlled interception guidance. Against a target that entered Soviet airspace briefly, photographed a designated area, and departed on a track the Soviet controllers could not predict, the Foxbat was less effective. The PR.9's operational technique, developed empirically over more than a decade, was to fly parallel to sensitive frontiers at altitude, using oblique cameras with focal lengths up to 48 inches, and to make actual overflights of Warsaw Pact territory only in specific circumstances and by specific authority. That authority rested from the mid-1960s onwards with the Prime Minister personally. Harold Wilson approved individual PR.9 missions over Warsaw Pact territory during his 1964-70 government. Edward Heath continued the practice from 1970. James Callaghan, during his 1976-79 tenure, is understood to have approved fewer such missions, reflecting a period of détente in which Whitehall assessed the political cost of a shoot-down as unacceptable. The declassified JIC papers held at TNA under CAB 158 and CAB 186, released in tranches since 2000, confirm the framework of ministerial control while leaving the specific missions redacted. What emerges from the released material is that the PR.9's peacetime intelligence value came less from overflights of Soviet territory than from oblique photography of the East German and Polish air defense systems, radar order of battle updates, and monitoring of Soviet forward-based air power in the group of Soviet forces Germany. The aircraft was a peripheral reconnaissance platform that could, when authorized, do more. Margaret Thatcher, when she came to Number 10 in May 1979, inherited both the aircraft and the authorization regime. She would use both. Sir Robert Armstrong, as Cabinet Secretary, briefed the incoming Prime Minister on the reconnaissance programme in the week of her arrival at Downing Street. The briefing, according to Peter Hennessy's later reconstruction of the Cabinet Office papers of that period, covered the PR.9's role, its authorization chain, and the diplomatic risks of the missions authorized at prime ministerial level. Thatcher's response, as recorded in her private office papers now held at the Churchill Archives Centre, was characteristically direct. She wanted to know what the aircraft had photographed that had actually changed a cabinet decision in the previous decade. Armstrong's answer drew on JYC assessments from 1968 onwards. The PR.9 had photographed Soviet reinforcement of Group of Soviet Forces Germany during the Prague Spring Crisis in August 1968, providing imagery that informed the British response to the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia. It had photographed the deployment of SS-4 and SS-5 medium-range ballistic missiles in East Germany, which underpinned NATO's nuclear planning group assessments in the early 1970s. It had provided imagery of Soviet naval infrastructure at Baltijsk and Kaliningrad. It had, in 1977 and 1978, produced the first RAF imagery of Soviet SS-20 Sabre mobile intermediate-range missile deployments in Belarusia, imagery that Callaghan's government had used and that Thatcher's would use more assertively in the debates within NATO that produced the December 1979 twin-track decision on intermediate nuclear forces. The PR.9 had, in short, contributed to every major British defence decision of the previous decade. Thatcher authorised its continued operation without modification to the existing arrangements. Number 10's approval of specific sensitive missions continued. What changed in the early 1980s was the operating environment. The Soviet air defence system had by then largely closed the direct overflight option. The PR-9's contribution shifted decisively towards peripheral reconnaissance, air-linked correlation, and support for GCHQ's signals intelligence collection. The aircraft carried from the mid-1970s onwards sensor packages developed at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough and RAE Bedford that recorded Soviet air defence radar emissions during flight along the inner German border and over the Baltic. Those recordings correlated with GCHQ intercepts of the associated voice traffic, allowed the JIC to build up a detailed picture of Warsaw Pact air defence readiness that was not available from any other source. When the Able Archer exercise of November 1983 produced Soviet reactions that some Western intelligence analysts subsequently interpreted as evidence of genuine Soviet fear of a NATO first strike, the PR.9's peripheral reconnaissance data formed part of the material later reviewed. The historiographical debate on Able Archer remains unresolved. Christopher Andrew, using Vasily Mitrokhin's material, has argued that the Soviet reaction was genuine. Other historians, including some working from the released JIC papers, have been more cautious. The PR.9 imagery from that period held at TNA under still partially closed files has been drawn on by both sides of that debate. What is not disputed is that the aircraft continued flying operationally throughout the crisis of 1983. It continued flying through the Falklands War of 1982, when 39 squadrons PR-9s at Whiten were held back from South Atlantic deployment, because their strategic reconnaissance role was judged more important than any tactical contribution they could make in the Falklands theatre. The Vulcan's Black Buck raids were more visible. The PR.9's contribution was quieter. It was also, in air staff terms, more valuable to sustain. The Falklands decision, taken at Northwood on April 5, 1982, was that the PR.9 fleet, by then reduced to a single squadron, 39 Squadron at Whiten, would maintain its European strategic role rather than deploy south. The reasoning minuted by Air Marshal Sir John Curtis as Air Commander of the task force was that no other British aircraft could replicate the PR.9's monitoring of Soviet air defence and reinforcement patterns in Central Europe, and that a Soviet decision to exploit British preoccupation with the South Atlantic remained a genuine possibility throughout April and May. Curtis's assessment reflected a wider Whitehall concern. The JIC's Current Intelligence Group on the Soviet Union produced a paper for the War Cabinet on April 12, 1982, assessing the probability of Soviet opportunism during the Falklands conflict. The paper drew heavily on PR.9 imagery of Warsaw Pact forward-deployed forces, arguing that no unusual concentrations were visible. The paper's conclusion that Soviet opportunism was unlikely, but that the reconnaissance coverage should be maintained without interruption, was accepted by Thatcher's War Cabinet. The PR-9S stayed at Whiten. During the 74 days of the Falklands Campaign, the squadron flew its normal operational tasks, monitored Warsaw Pact activity, and provided imagery to Jarek on a routine basis. When the Argentine surrender came on June 14th, the reconnaissance coverage of Central Europe had not been degraded for a single week. That continuity mattered because the mid-1980s were about to become one of the tensest periods of the Cold War. The Reagan administration's strategic rearmament, the deployment of Pershing II and cruise missiles to Western Europe from November 1983, and the death of 3 Soviet leaders in quick succession, Brezhnev in November 1982, Andropov in February 1984, Chernenko in March 1985, produced a period in which Whitehall's intelligence requirements on Soviet military dispositions intensified sharply. The PR.9 flew accordingly. It also by this stage showed its age. The airframe designed in 1955 was operating in an environment that had changed beyond recognition. Sir Michael Beetham, as Chief of the Air Staff from 1977 to 1982, had already commissioned studies of replacement platforms. The RAF's assessment was that no British aircraft in development or in service could replace the PR.9 in its specific role. The Nimrod R.1, operated by 51 Squadron from Whiten, performed the signals intelligence role brilliantly, but could not carry the PR.9's optical sensors. The Tornado GR.1, entering service from 1982, was a strike aircraft rather than a strategic reconnaissance platform. American systems, the SR-71 Blackbird, the U-2R, and from the mid-1980s, the various satellite constellations of the National Reconnaissance Office, provided some of what the PR.9 provided, but they were American assets under American tasking. Whitehall wanted a British asset under British tasking, providing imagery that flowed into the JIC without passing through Washington. The PR.9 remained that asset. It would remain so until 2006, 15 years after the Cold War ended. Within the 1945 to 1991 scope, however, the aircraft's final decade of Cold War service was characterized by a role that had shifted decisively towards peripheral reconnaissance, ELINT collection, and support for GCHQ. Sir Brian Cartledge, as British ambassador to Moscow from 1985 to 1988, reported extensively on the Gorbachev leadership. His reports drew at points on JYC assessments that, in turn, drew on PR.9 imagery. The aircraft was still, in 1988, photographing Warsaw Pact air defence dispositions from over 60,000 feet along the inner German border, and no operational Warsaw Pact air defence system had reliably engaged it in nearly 3 decades of operation. The technical reasons for that record deserve examination, because they explain something about British defence engineering in the Cold War that is rarely explored. The PR.9 achieved its performance through a series of design decisions taken at Wharton and Samlesbury between 1955 and 1958 that were at the time unfashionable. English Electric chose to extend and thicken the Canberra wing rather than adopt a new planform. Freddie Page's team at Wharton kept the original fuselage cross-section, the tailplane geometry, and the general handling characteristics of the aircraft, on the grounds that the RAF's Canberra crews were already trained on the type, and that a radically new aircraft would require a training pipeline the Air Ministry could not readily fund. The choice was pragmatic. It was also correct. The PR.9's wing, at 67 feet 10 inches span with an area of 989 square feet, produced a wing loading low enough to sustain flight at 65,000 feet, where the air density is approximately 1/10 that at sea level. The Avon RA-29 engines, developed by Rolls-Royce at Derby under the direction of Sir Stanley Hooker's successors, delivered thrust that did not degrade excessively at extreme altitude. The specific fuel consumption at cruise altitude was better than the standard Avon, by a margin that operational crews later measured at approximately 15%. The camera fit was developed at the Royal Aircraft Establishment at Farnborough and by BAC's own optical laboratory. The primary sensor was the f.96 forward-facing camera with a 48-inch focal length, mounted in the nose for oblique photography. Vertical cameras, typically the f.49 for survey work and the f.95 for detail, were carried in the fuselage bay. The film was Kodak aerographic, processed at Jarrick, Brampton within hours of landing. Crews were trained at 231 OCU at Bassingbourn, later at Whiten itself. Navigator training emphasized the astrocompass, since Doppler and inertial navigation were not fitted to early PR-9S, and the aircraft frequently operated beyond the range of ground-based navigation aids. Squadron leader Alan Pollock, later famous for a low-level flypast of Tower Bridge in a Hunter, flew PR-9s on 58 Squadron in the mid-1960s and described the aircraft, in an oral history recorded for the RAF Museum, as the finest strategic instrument the Royal Air Force ever operated in peacetime. The remark deserves qualification. The V-bombers were, in nuclear deterrent terms, more strategically important. The Polaris and Trident submarine forces were, from 1969 onwards, more central to British nuclear posture. The PR.9's strategic importance lay elsewhere. In the peacetime intelligence that shaped cabinet decisions, JIC assessments, and NATO planning, over a period in which no other British aircraft could have gathered comparable material. The aircraft's contribution to British Cold War intelligence has been assessed by historians working in the released papers at TNA. Christopher Andrew, in his Authorized History of MI5, touches on the PR.9's role in specific counterintelligence operations. Peter Hennessy, in his work on the Cabinet Office, has traced the authorization chain for reconnaissance operations at prime ministerial level. Sir Lawrence Freedman, whose official history of the Falklands Campaign draws on the Curtis Papers, notes the decision to retain the PR.9 fleet in Europe. What none of these historians has been able to establish from the material so far declassified is the total number of overflights of Warsaw Pact territory that the PR.9 fleet conducted between 1961 and 1991. The number remains classified. The aircraft's operational record in that specific sense is not yet complete in the public domain. Robert Kemble retired from the RAF in the early 1980s. John Crampton, who had flown the Sculthorpe Tornado in 1952, died in 2010, having spoken publicly about the operation only after its declassification in 1994. The PR.9 fleet, never more than about 20 aircraft, operated by a rotating cast of squadrons, but ending with 39 Squadron at Wyton and, from 1982, at Marham, continued flying long after the Berlin Wall came down on November 9, 1989, and the Warsaw Pact dissolved on July 1, 1991. The Cold War for the aircraft ended not with a change of mission, but with a gradual retasking towards the reconnaissance requirements of new conflicts. The Gulf War of 1991, the Balkans, and eventually operations that fall outside the 1945 to 1991 scope. What remained at the end of the Cold War was a question about how much the aircraft had actually mattered. The evidence available from released papers suggests it had mattered a great deal. The JIC's Soviet Committee, in a valedictory assessment of Cold War intelligence sources produced in 1992 and partially released under the Waldegrave Initiative in 1993, ranked the PR.9's imagery contribution as of substantial and sustained value throughout the period 1961 to 1989. Sir Percy Cradock, as chairman of the JIC from 1985 to 1992, had drawn on PR.9 material in briefing Thatcher on Soviet developments during the Gorbachev period. His memoir, published in 2002, refers obliquely to the reconnaissance program without naming the aircraft. The Foreign Office's Northern Department, which handled Soviet affairs, similarly drew on the imagery for its assessments of Soviet military policy. The Ministry of Defence's Directorate of Scientific Intelligence used PR.9 material for its analyses of Soviet air defense radar developments, work that fed into the Cheveline program's targeting studies and later into Tridents. The aircraft's contribution, in short, ran through the whole architecture of British Cold War intelligence. The reason it could do so came back to the specific technical achievement of English Electric's design office in 1955. The PR.9 flew higher than the systems designed to shoot it down. It did so, unmodified in essentials, for 30 years. The engineering margin that Page's team had built into the aircraft in the mid-1950s proved sufficient to outlast every major generation of Soviet air defense, the SA-2, SA-3, SA-5, SA-10, that Warsaw Pact forces deployed against Western reconnaissance. That is not a common outcome in military aviation. Aircraft designed to defeat specific threats usually fall behind those threats within a decade. The PR.9 did not, because it had been designed against a physical envelope, altitude and speed at that altitude, rather than against a specific opposing system. The consequence was 3 decades of intelligence collection that fed directly into Downing Street, Whitehall and Cheltenham. Whether that intelligence changed the course of the Cold War is a question Christopher Andrew, Peter Hennessy and Lawrence Freedman have all approached, and none has fully answered because the primary material remains partially closed at TNA. What can be said from the released papers is that the PR.9 gave successive British governments an independent view of Soviet military reality that they would not otherwise have possessed. Attlee had asked in 1951 for the RAF to be able to see into the Soviet Union. Thatcher in 1988 was still receiving imagery that the same program had generated. The aircraft that Beaumont had flown from Samlesbury on July 27, 1958 was, by then, one of the longest continuously operational strategic assets in the RAF's history. Its Cold War was ending. Its final flight was still 18 years away.